well those people are getting along. So, I mean, based off of what we can observe from others, simply because we're comparative, we can best map out, given the ways that we exist and the narrative that we want to act out, how likely is that to get us what we want based off of what we see from other people, roughly. And so we know, and also, like, to add to this, because traits do distribute themselves rather randomly, and it's the case that each person gets a different measuring of each trait to themselves. The ways that traits are distributed out towards individuals has a lot to say about their success in any given venture. I mean, if somebody's agreeable, conscientious people tend to have less divorces on average and tend to report that they have more meaningful relationships than other people. And there's a reason for that. And some people might, and there's a group of people that would find that very disheartening, because maybe they value those same things, but they find it difficult for themselves to acquire those things because they're not very conscientious or they're not very agreeable. It's also the case that disagreeable people make more money on average than agreeable people, because they're more willing to negotiate and because they're disagreeable, so they're more willing to put their neck out to get things to go their way. And people, because we live in a Western society who value money, they're not going to like the fact that there's many reasons why people are not going to like the fact that something that is mostly innate and mostly innate is creates results that are very consequential, and those differences are not irreducible and dissoluble. I mean, you can't. Temperamental variances, despite what anybody wants to believe, are fairly stable. I mean, if you're highly neurotic when you're born, you're going to be highly neurotic when you're older. I mean, it's not the case that you can't learn different behaviors to help you deal with your neuroticism, and it's not the case that if you're a disagreeable person, you can't learn to be more socially adept or better at being cooperative and negotiative when it makes sense for you. But it is the case that if you're a disagreeable person, you don't mind competing with people, and it's never going to go, and the fact that you're a competitive person is never going to go away in your life. Like, that's not going to be the case. And how often you're willing to be argumentative or aggressive with other people. You're going to be more willing to be argumentative and aggressive with other people than the next person is who's not as disagreeable as you are. And it's the case that that's not going to change all that much as you get older. I mean, you learn different things. You certainly learn more, and people evolve and grow as individuals over time. But that evolution and growth has to deal with the fact that you're an individual that's plastic in the sense that your temperamental factors are amenable to behavioral influences. I mean, you're quasi-behavioralistically based as a creature, so you can behave differently. But just because you behave a certain way doesn't mean the motivational landscape changes for you as an individual, and it doesn't mean that your proclivities change as an individual either. Because I mean, like, it's certainly the case that if somebody is more, let's say somebody's more sexually open than another person, and they're highly sexually motivated and interested, they don't have to go and sleep around with 101 people, and they're not necessarily going to be. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing that motivates them to act in the world, and it's certainly the case that there might be other things that motivate them to act in the world that makes it such that they don't act on those things always. But it's not ever the case that they don't have a taste or they don't have a reason for wanting to pay attention to a certain phenomenon in the environment, or the way that certain things tend to sort themselves out in any given situation, because they're just disposed to be that way. And I mean, But the fact that people are deposed to be ways in the first place makes it such that you have it such that different people achieve different things just because of temperamental differences in people. And different people are successful because of the temperamental variances that they come into the world with. And if you're observing these things and know that you don't come with those temperamental variances, and you want to be the thing on top, and you want it to be the case that you can be just as successful as the most successful person, that puts a damper in your plans, and you're not too keen about that. I mean, because you're a motivational creature, you're not completely pro-social, and it's the case that you have the antisocial aspects of yourself to get what you want, basically, or to get your way. And within the suite of the antisocial toolkits, or the motivational appraisal factors that we have, envy and resentment are at the front door in terms of human emotions that make themselves available to you in your wanting to dissent from the social ordering of things. Very much so. And it's the case that your inferior function is something that you're rather insecure about, because it's the very thing that you can observe in the world that either most people are fairly competent at, or there are quite a few people that are exceedingly competent at its use and its wielding, but you yourself are a piker. You know, you're not very impressive. And it's the case that you know you're not. Like, you legitimately know you're not. Because you're social, you know you're not. And that doesn't sit well with you. And oftentimes it's going to cause people to behave differently towards you because you're not very good at it, because people are judgmental and they're trying to figure out if you're the thing that ought to sit on the top or not. And so they're going to appraise you poorly, and they may not value you for the things that you are good at. That's always a possibility. And so that's going to make you resentful towards people, and then you're going to be very envious. I mean, like, that's not a guarantee, but I mean, it's the case that if you're willing to, I'm willing to bet that the things that people tend to envy other people for are things that are tied to their inferior function, or that are a result because of their inferior, or the subconscious functions. But I'm not even gonna get into that. I'm just gonna talk about your inferior function. So it's the case that your inferior function spurs you to be resentful and envious, because you're not the only person living in the world, and it's the case that there are other people living in the world that are more exceptional at that thing than you are. And their exceptionality definitely tells you what place you could possibly sit at. And no person likes to be in hell. And nobody wants to exist at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. And there's a reason for that, because people who exist at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy get stepped on, just to put it crudely. You know, if you're looking at like a herd of buffalo, the ones that don't make the cut sit on the outside, and the ones that sit on the outside of the herd of buffalo are the ones that are most likely to be picked off by predators. It's also the case that they don't get the best feeding rights. Like, they're not going to get access to the best cud or whatever, you know, like, or grass to make the best cud. It's the case that also their offspring, because, well, we're not purely eugenically based as creatures, but I mean, their offsprings carry deleterious genetic material, and animals are cruel. Animals are cruel from a I guess egalitarian narrative, because I mean, like, it's the case that, look, nothing likes to be treaded on. Like, nothing likes to be treaded on, but it's the fact that people are going to tread on you if they think that you're inferior. Like, that's the bottom line. Like, that really is the case. And that's why people don't want to be at the bottom of a dominance hierarchy, because you're more likely to die. And it's the case that people who are impoverished for multiple reasons experience sickness, famine, and death more frequently than those who aren't. And I mean, poverty is just a proxy for status in this case. I mean, there's nothing inherently morally wrong with impoverished people or anything like that. But it's just the case that, for whatever reason, depending on whatever society that they're a part of, whatever traits that constitute them do not make it such that they're the thing that can sit at the top, and so they suffer for it. They very much so suffer for it, because, I mean, everything is just, our societies, our communities, our groups, even our interactions with one another is just one big selection mechanism, because it's only motivated by just one giant selection mechanism. And it's the case that the inferior function feels the rub of that. It feels the rub of that very, very hard, because whatever you would like to believe about yourself, you are sensitive to some degree. Like, whether you think you are or you aren't, whether you think you are or you're not, you are sensitive. I mean, it depends on where somebody touches you. That's all the, because you're vulnerable. I mean, like, just the disposition of a human being is to be vulnerable. That's why there is existential tragedy in reality, or that's why that phenomenological factor is a thing. And it's the case that the inferior function is the thing that heralds that in your existence, or brings that to your attention most clearly, because it's sort of the thing that you know is your, well, that's why it's called the inferior function, because it's the thing, it's your inferior, it's the inferior side of yourself, and it's not like that's something that's easy, particularly easy for you to square away, being the social, judgmental creature that you are. Whether or not you're praising yourself, or whether or not other people are praising you, or whether or not you're praising other people. I mean, like, that's just the way that it goes. And so it's the fact that if you're praising yourself, if you don't cultivate the ability to be honest with yourself, you will repress yourself. You will do it because you don't want to look. Like, it's too hard for you to look. And you'll come up with every other explanation and narrative for why people react to you in the ways that they do, or why people think the things that they think about you. You'll come up with all sorts of narratives that will not bear, I mean, like, I can't say that they won't bear the likeness to the truth in any way, shape, or form, but, I mean, they're conveniently set up in such a way that you will never, ever touch the root cause of your, slow dread and terror, because, I mean, it's the case, like, there's also another reason why I encourage people to be honest with themselves, and it has to deal with a representation of the truth that the Jews have in mind. So the Jews thought, like, at least the way that they, when they use truth in the Old Testament, or even in the New Testament, because it's just a play on Judaism, when they talk about truth, they have this idea that the truth is something that necessarily leads to life. It's the thing that makes it such that other things can't exist, and other things are more likely to exist when it's around. Lies, however, lead to death. And, I mean, from a rough, I guess, thought experimental approximation, you could see why that most likely would be the case. Because if you were mistaken about, how heavy or how hard something was back in that time, like, you know, Alexander the Great is a good example, because part of the thing that led to his downfall was his inability to be honest with himself, and part of the reason his men dissented from him was because he was a bit too, not only was he too maniacal, but he was too romantic. Like, the chances of human beings being able to walk on foot the distances through the conditions that he forced his men to walk through are very, very slim, and it's a good chance that most of them are going to die. If you don't tell them that's part of the deal, because it's not like people aren't willing to do those sorts of things if there isn't a sufficient why. But if you don't get that straight and you don't tell people that when they're signing up for that venture, they're going to be very, very resentful towards you when they find out that that's the case. Like, and they're not going to trust you. They're going to stop following you. And, I mean, human beings are like that. And it's the case that your life, to some degree, is like that. It's very much so like that. You have the opportunity, not because you're inherently immoral, but just because your brain's not necessarily interested in causing you to always see the truth. You're very much liable in your capacity to lie to yourself. And it's the case that repression is a means of doing that to oneself or with oneself. You hide the things that are least amenable to your narrative away from yourself. and you're prone to confirmation bias, and your capacity for I suppose cognitive dissonance is incredible, like just utterly incredible. And I mean, everybody's like that in some way, or everybody has that temptation to be that way in some way, because it's inspired or it's spurred on by your relationship to, if you have a rather contentious relationship with your inferior function. It's spurred on or inspired by the contentious relationship you have with your inferior function, or at least that's one way to think about it. And it's a result of your human nature. And I mean, and that's the mechanism, and that's why people develop shadows, because it's not like your inferior function is the only thing that instigates this. In the whole repertoire of the potential complexes you can form over your lifetime, and it's not just because something's a complex, it doesn't mean it's negative. I mean, like, behaviors are complexes, but it's the case that you can have some fairly pernicious ones, and it's the case that there are plenty of, you're more inferior than you are superior in many, many ways. Like you don't, how limited and poorly put together you are as a creature is more so apparent oftentimes than how extraordinary you are, or how amazing you are. And that's the case for the human condition, period. I mean, that's why there are misanthropes in the world. But it's the case that, you know, because that's a truth, or that's a thing, then people have shadows, because it's not like people want to know those things about themselves. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to know those things about yourself. Mostly because you're social. You know it will be judged, and you will judge yourself. Like, that's the other thing too. Like, people are judgmental of themselves. Like, it's crazy. It really is crazy. And like, if you're not being honest with yourself. You're not really being honest with yourself, because there are things that you value that you're not particularly good at. That's the truth for every person, and it's going to put a very contentious relationship between yourself and that thing, and it's going to be a thing that you would want to repress or act like it doesn't exist, or it doesn't affect you in the ways that it does. The reality is it does, and if you attempt to, because it's going to make you envious and resentful of other people, and it's going to make you envious and resentful of other people, and it's going to make you resentful of yourself. Like, at least it can very well make those things a very real possibility. And so you have a choice to make, like, basically, you know, the great cosmic struggle. Are you going to be honest with yourself and try and create the best relationship you can between yourself and your inferior function? Or are you going to be resentful of yourself and repress not only yourself but other people, and your observations of reality? You know, are you going to willingly become blind, deaf, and mute because you won't deal with the truth? That's why the Bible says the truth will set you free. I mean, like, at least that's why I think the Bible says that. Like, I mean, no Christian is going to agree with me, but I mean, that's my interpretation. But it's the case that because you're like that, like, you're more like that than you know. You're more willing to be a conspirator to the tragedy of your existence more than you're probably willing to admit it, or believe so that you are. And there's multiple reasons for that, and that's not all your fault. Like, that's not all your fault. But it's the case that you have to deal with it. And so, that's life. That's why it's a bitch sometimes. Like, that's why it's a bitch sometimes. But yeah, that's your relationship with your inferior function. And that's why it's like that. It's like that, and that's the way it is. You know? But alright, so that's my video. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you found it interesting.